I am Harper, 33 years old, and a week after my grandmother passed away, I hired a crew to renovate the crumbling house she left me. The foreman called me, his voice shaking, telling me they found something hidden inside the walls, and that I needed to get there immediately. He specifically told me not to let my parents or my sister know. When I arrived, the police were already securing the basement, and the contents of a hidden safe changed my family forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The air in the downtown law office was freezing, smelling of polished leather and stale coffee. We were gathered for the reading of my grandmother Beatrice's will. My mother Patricia sat perfectly upright, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag with manicured fingers. My father William checked his luxury watch as if this entire process was merely a brief interruption to his busy schedule. Across from me sat my younger sister Victoria, the undisputed golden child of our family, leaning casually against her husband Marcus. Marcus was a slick investment banker who wore his expensive tailored suits like armor. I sat alone at the edge of the massive mahogany table, bracing myself for what I knew would be an uncomfortable afternoon. I just did not realize how vicious it was about to become. The estate lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He slid a thick, glossy folder directly across the table toward Victoria. He announced that Victoria was receiving the entirety of the liquid assets, a bank statement reflecting $4.5 million, along with the deeds to the pristine suburban family estate. Victoria let out a practiced gasp of delight, pressing a hand to her chest, while Marcus wrapped a supportive, triumphant arm around her shoulder. My parents beamed at her with undisguised pride. Then the lawyer turned to me. He did not pass me a glossy folder. Instead, he reached into his drawer and pulled out a heavy, rusted set of iron keys attached to a frayed string. He pushed them across the smooth wood of the table. They stopped right in front of me with a harsh, metallic clatter. He informed me that I was inheriting the old property on Elm Street, a dilapidated Victorian house that had been sitting abandoned and rotting for over a decade. But that was not all. He slid a single, thin sheet of paper next to the keys. It was a notice of outstanding property taxes. I was inheriting a house with a failing foundation and a $50,000 tax debt. The silence in the room was suffocating. I stared at the rusted keys, my mind racing. A $50,000 debt was a death sentence for my small architectural appraisal and antique restoration business. I looked up, searching the faces of my family for any sign of sympathy or shock. There was none. My mother Patricia simply smirked. She picked up her designer bag and placed it on her lap. Maybe if you had not wasted your life appraising dusty old trash instead of going to law school, Grandma would have trusted you with real money. Her words hit me like a physical blow, yet they were entirely predictable. This was the same woman who had cut off all my financial support the moment I changed my college major at 22. My parents had always demanded conformity and status. Because I chose to preserve history and restore old architecture instead of chasing a corporate title, I became the family embarrassment. They made sure I paid for that choice every single day. My father just crossed his arms and looked out the window, offering his silent, crushing agreement to her insult. Before I could even process the humiliation, Marcus leaned forward. He rested his elbows on the mahogany table, looking at me with the predatory smile of a man who knew he had cornered his prey. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a pre-written contract, sliding it smoothly across the table until it covered the tax notice. "Sign the house over to my limited liability company for $10,000, Harper Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You cannot afford the taxes anyway. The city will seize the property by the end of the month. Take the 10 grand, pay off some of your little business loans, and let the adults handle the real estate." I looked from the contract to Marcus, then to Victoria, who was busy admiring her reflection in her phone screen. They had planned this. They knew exactly what was in that will, and Marcus had come prepared to strip me of the one final connection I had to my grandmother. They wanted me to walk away with nothing but a humiliating handout. The old Harper. The daughter who desperately craved her parents' approval and her sister's basic respect might have broken down in tears. She might have signed the paper just to escape the suffocating judgment in that room. But I was not that girl anymore. I had spent years crawling my way up in the appraisal industry, learning the hidden value of things that other people threw away. I looked Marcus dead in the eye. I reached out my fingers, brushing against the crisp edge of his contract. I picked it up, feeling the weight of their expectant gazes. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, I tore the contract in half. Marcus dropped his smile. Victoria finally looked up from her phone, her mouth falling open in shock. My mother gasped, offended by my sheer audacity. "Keep your $10,000, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. I stood up, grabbing the rusted keys and wrapping my fingers tightly around the cold metal. "I am not selling the only thing my grandmother actually wanted me to have." My father slammed his hand on the table, warning me not to be stupid. He told me I was making a financial mistake that would ruin me. I ignored him. I turned my back on the $4.5 million, the smug investment banker, the golden child sister, and the parents who had never truly seen me. I walked out of that freezing office with my head held high, the heavy keys cutting into my palm. I did not know how I was going to pay the $50,000 tax debt, but I knew I would rather lose everything than surrender to their manipulation. I was going to restore that house if it was the last thing I did. The tires of my beat-up sedan crunched over the overgrown gravel driveway of Grandma Beatrice's estate. The house loomed against the gray morning sky. It was a massive Queen Anne Victorian choked by decades of ivy and neglect. The wraparound porch sagged and the paint was peeling like dead skin. But beneath the decay, the bones of the house were magnificent. I dragged my suitcases up the creaking steps, unlocked the heavy oak door with the rusted key, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ancient timber. I immediately called Diego. Diego was a brilliant, independent contractor I had worked with on dozens of historical restoration projects. He was honest to a fault and completely immune to the corporate bullying my family relied on. He arrived within the hour with his crew and support beams. The priority was the basement foundation, which had settled dangerously. Diego and his team descended into the dark cellar while I set up a makeshift office in the grand parlor, determined to map out a recovery plan. I slept on an air mattress that night, wrapped in 3 blankets, listening to the house settle around me in the dark. The very next morning, aggressive pounding on the front door jolted me awake. I threw on heavy work boots and rushed to the entryway. Standing on my porch was a stern-faced man in a sharp gray suit, holding a leather clipboard flanked by 2 city police officers. He flashed a badge identifying him as a senior municipal structural inspector. He did not bother with a polite greeting. He simply thrust a bright yellow piece of paper toward my chest, announcing that he was officially condemning the property. He claimed the house was an immediate public hazard, citing severe foundation instability. He ordered me to vacate the premises within 24 hours so the city could demolish the structure completely to the ground. The sheer speed of this ambush told me everything. The city never moved this fast. Marcus and Victoria had pulled strings, cashing in political favors to fast-track a demolition order. They wanted to tear down my grandmother's legacy, to turn the lot into a quick profit. The inspector pulled a pen from his pocket and demanded my signature on the vacate order, speaking to me as if I had no right to be there. I did not take the pen. I crossed my arms and stepped squarely into the doorway, blocking his path. I asked him to cite the specific municipal codes he was invoking to condemn a registered century-old structure without a prior warning citation or formal notice. He smirked, rattling off a generic local ordinance regarding exterior decay. I smiled back, but my eyes were pure ice. I informed him that his generic ordinance did not apply here. I cited Section 412 of the State Historical Preservation Code, which strictly grandfathered this specific architectural style against immediate demolition without a 30-day independent engineering review. I then pointed to Diego, who had just walked up the porch steps, wiping grease from his hands. I introduced Diego as a fully licensed structural engineer executing an approved stabilization permit which I had filed online at 4 in the morning. I informed the inspector that any attempt to condemn a property undergoing active legally permitted restoration was a direct violation of state property law. I pulled up the digital permit on my phone and shoved the screen in his face. I promised him that if he did not get off my porch, I would sue the city for targeted harassment and file a formal complaint against his personal license. The inspector turned pale. He snatched the yellow paper back, muttered a curse under his breath, and marched down the steps with the officers trailing behind him. My phone started ringing the exact second the inspector's car pulled out of the driveway. The caller ID flashed Victoria's name. I answered it, putting the phone on speaker. Victoria's shrill, mocking laughter filled the dusty parlor. She asked how I was enjoying my new condemned dumpster. She bragged that Marcus had the city planning commissioner on speed dial and that I was completely out of my depth. "You always loved living in the dirt," Harper Victoria sneered through the phone. "You are just like you were at 25. Remember when you begged Mom and Dad to pay your hospital bills after your car accident and Dad told you to just walk it off? You have always been pathetic. You are fighting a war you cannot win. Sign the house over to Marcus, or we will make sure you end up sleeping on the actual street." I listened to her cruel voice, remembering the agonizing pain of that accident and the cold reality of my parents refusing to help me because I had chosen a career they deemed unworthy. I did not yell. I simply told Victoria that she had better tell her husband to hire better corrupt officials because the house was legally secure. I hung up the phone before she could respond, cutting off her toxic voice and leaving the house in complete silence. I took a deep breath, letting the rushing adrenaline slowly drain from my exhausted system. I had won the first battle, but I knew Marcus would not stop. He would find another legal loophole to starve me out, using his endless corporate wealth. I turned back toward the grand parlor to grab my heavy architectural blueprints. That was when I heard heavy, rapid footsteps pounding up the basement stairs. The wooden door flew open with a loud, violent crash. Diego stood there breathing heavily. His hands were covered in white plaster dust, and his face was drained of color. He looked absolutely terrified. "Miss Harper," Diego said, his voice trembling as he looked back down the dark stairwell. "You need to come down here right now before anyone else arrives." I followed Diego down the narrow wooden stairs, my heavy work boots thudding against the hollow steps. The basement was damp and smelled intensely of mildew and ancient earth. Construction lights cast harsh yellow shadows against the exposed brick foundation. Diego led me to the far corner of the cellar, right beneath what used to be my grandmother's sitting room. His crew had been clearing away water-damaged plaster to reinforce the load-bearing beams. Now a massive hole gaped in the wall. Diego pointed a trembling, calloused finger at the cavity. He wiped his brow with a dusty rag. "Ma'am, we found something," he said, keeping his voice to a harsh whisper. "Come here immediately, but do not tell your parents or your sister." I stepped closer, shining my phone flashlight into the dark recess. Nestled tightly between the original stone foundation and the false plaster wall sat a massive, heavy-duty fireproof safe. It was covered in decades of grime, entirely hidden from the outside world. "This wall was built recently," Diego explained, running his hand along the broken plaster edges. "Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, tops. Someone sealed this up in a hurry and did a remarkably sloppy job." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. 2 years ago was exactly when Marcus and Victoria started handling my grandmother's finances, claiming her mind was failing, and she needed their corporate expertise to protect her assets. "We cannot just leave it here," I said, my voice echoing in the damp space. "Can you open it without destroying the contents?" Diego nodded slowly. He grabbed an industrial angle grinder and a heavy crowbar from his toolbox. For the next hour, sparks flew, and the screech of tearing metal filled the basement. I stood back, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching as Diego expertly dismantled the locking mechanism. With a final ear-splitting crack, the heavy steel door swung open. A cloud of stale air puffed out into the room. I knelt on the cold dirt floor and reached inside. I expected to find old jewelry, maybe some antique silver or forgotten heirloom coins. Instead, my hands brushed against stacks of paper. I pulled out a heavy stack of leather-bound ledgers, a small black USB drive, and a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. I broke the wax seal with shaking fingers. Inside was a stack of handwritten pages dating back exactly 18 months. It was my grandmother's unmistakable elegant cursive. The heading at the top of the first page made my blood run cold. It read, "My final and true last will and testament." I skimmed the first few lines of the document. My grandmother stated clearly that any subsequent wills, especially those drawn up by Marcus or his slick legal team, were entirely fraudulent and obtained under extreme duress. She detailed that the entire $4.5 million estate was to be left solely in my care, knowing I was the only person in the family who valued her legacy over her bank account. She explicitly wrote that Patricia and William were to receive absolutely nothing due to their financial manipulations. My chest tightened as I realized the immense scale of the fraud my parents and sister had committed. This was not just a greedy family dispute over property. This was a highly orchestrated federal crime. I looked at Diego, who was watching me with deep concern. "Stop all construction immediately," I ordered. "Send your crew home for the day with full pay. We need to call the authorities right now." I dialed the local police precinct, directly requesting a senior investigator rather than a patrol unit, citing a major financial crime and forged legal documents. Because I did not use the emergency line, it took them 45 minutes to arrive in an unmarked vehicle, maintaining the silent discretion I had desperately requested. A seasoned police detective named Miller stepped into the basement. He wore a rumpled trench coat and carried a high-resolution digital camera. I explained the entire situation, detailing the fraudulent will reading at the upscale lawyer's office, Marcus's aggressive buyout offer, the fake city inspector, and the sudden discovery of this hidden safe. Detective Miller listened in absolute silence, his face entirely devoid of emotion. He put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully extracted the ledgers from the safe, laying them out on a folding work table Diego had provided. He opened the first ledger. It was not a financial record book at all. It was a highly detailed daily medical log kept by my grandmother's private in-home nurse, a woman Patricia had abruptly fired a year before my grandmother passed away. The detective flipped through the fragile pages, his jaw tightening with every single line he read. He took dozens of photos of the pages, his camera flashing brightly in the dim, dusty cellar. I paced back and forth across the dirt floor, my anxiety spiking as I watched his expression turn grim. "What is it?" I asked, unable to handle the agonizing silence any longer. "What do those books say about my family?" Detective Miller closed the heavy ledger and looked up at me. The air in the basement suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. He took off his glasses and let out a long, heavy sigh. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice deadly serious, "you need to prepare yourself for what I am about to tell you." I stepped forward, my hands gripping the edge of the folding table so hard my knuckles turned pure white. The detective placed his gloved hand flat against the cover of the medical log. "Your grandmother did not die of natural decline," he told me, holding my gaze without blinking. "According to these daily logs, her cognitive failures were not the result of age or dementia. These medical records show a sudden massive influx of highly restricted narcotics. These logs show she was being heavily drugged with unauthorized sedatives right before every single legal meeting with Marcus and your parents." I stared at Detective Miller, the damp basement air suddenly turning to ice in my lungs. My parents had drugged my grandmother. They had deliberately stripped away her mind to steal her money. The nausea hit me in a violent wave, but the burning fury immediately swallowed it whole. I looked down at the folding table, my eyes locking onto the small black USB drive sitting next to the medical ledgers. I grabbed the drive and told the detective not to move. I sprinted up the wooden stairs, my heavy boots hammering against the treads, and retrieved my laptop from the parlor. When I returned to the basement, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely insert the drive into the port. A single folder appeared on the screen. It was labeled with a date from exactly 14 months ago. I clicked the file. A high-definition video opened, displaying a wide-angle view of my grandmother Beatrice inside her private nursing home suite. The camera had been cleverly hidden, likely tucked inside the digital clock sitting on her television stand. The video showed my grandmother sitting in her recliner. She looked terribly frail, her head lolling to the side, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Then the heavy wooden door to her suite swung open. My mother Patricia strode into the room, followed closely by my father and Marcus. Marcus was carrying his signature leather briefcase. The audio was crystal clear. My mother snapped her fingers directly in front of my grandmother's face, treating her like an unruly dog. "Wake up, Beatrice," my mother hissed. "It is time to sign the papers." My grandmother mumbled incoherently, her chin resting on her chest, completely unable to lift her heavy head or swat their hands away. Marcus pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and spread them across the tray table. These were the documents signing over the $4.5 million fortune and granting absolute power of attorney to Marcus and his private hedge fund. My father stood by the door, acting as a lookout, checking the hallway every few seconds. My mother grabbed a pen, wrapped her manicured fingers tightly around my grandmother's frail, trembling hand, and physically forced her to sign her name on every single page. "We did it," Marcus said on the recording, his voice dripping with arrogant satisfaction as he packed away the stolen fortune. "The old bat is completely out of it. Now we just need to get our hands on the Elm Street house before she kicks the bucket." I paused the video. The blood roared in my ears. Detective Miller stood rigid beside me, his jaw clenched tight. The jagged pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with sickening absolute clarity. Marcus did not want this rotting Victorian house to build condos. He did not care about the empty lot. He cared about what was trapped inside the architecture. I opened the next file on the USB drive. It was a digital scan of a handwritten letter from my grandmother explaining exactly why she had purchased the hidden camera and the fireproof safe. She knew they were poisoning her. She knew her mind was slipping away during their visits. In her final moments of clarity, she had taken her most valuable assets and buried them where my parents would never think to look. The letter detailed that millions of dollars in original, untraceable bearer bonds and the encrypted passwords to massive offshore accounts were currently sealed inside the walls of this very house. Marcus knew the monies was here. He knew the house was a literal vault. That was why he had shoved that $10,000 buyout contract in my face at the lawyer's office. That was why Victoria had anonymously called the city inspectors to fast-track a demolition order this morning. If the city condemned the house, Marcus could buy the demolished lot for pennies, sift through the rubble, and walk away with the hidden bonds completely untaxed and undetected. They were trying to bankrupt me so they could loot my grandmother's walls. Detective Miller pulled out his phone and dialed a number. He spoke in low, rapid tones using police codes I did not understand. He hung up and looked at me with a completely different expression. "This is no longer a local fraud dispute, Miss Harper," he said. "This is grand larceny, elder abuse, and a massive federal conspiracy." Within 2 hours, the quiet, overgrown street outside my house was completely blocked off by a fleet of unmarked black SUVs. My dusty parlor was transformed into a bustling command center. Agents in tactical gear secured the perimeter, while forensic technicians began scanning the basement walls for further hidden compartments. A tall, sharply dressed man with a severe expression walked into the parlor and introduced himself as Special Agent Davis from the FBI Financial Crimes Division. He reviewed the nursing home video and the medical ledgers with cold, calculating efficiency. He closed my laptop and looked me dead in the eye. "Your family ran a highly sophisticated criminal operation," Agent Davis said, folding his arms. "The evidence here proves elder abuse and forced coercion. But Marcus is a professional shark. We ran a preliminary check while driving over here. The $4.5 million he stole from the liquid accounts is already gone." I stared at him, panic rising in my throat. "What do you mean it is gone?" Agent Davis leaned closer, his voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. "We need to trace where Marcus moved the money, but he's hidden it behind shell companies. We need him to confess on tape." I stared at Agent Davis, the reality of his words settling over me like a heavy lead blanket. Confess on tape. It sounded like something out of a cheap spy movie, not my actual life. But the stakes were terrifyingly real. Marcus and Victoria had stolen $4.5 million, effectively murdering my grandmother in the process, and now they were coming for the last piece of the puzzle. I nodded slowly to the federal agent. I told him I would do whatever it took to burn their empire to the ground. Agent Davis instructed me to play dumb to act like a desperate cornered animal and let them think their intimidation tactics were working. He handed me a tiny covert recording device disguised as a standard car key fob and told me to keep it on me at all times. The federal agents packed up their gear and vanished as silently as they had arrived, leaving the house empty and waiting. I did not have to wait long for my family to make their next move. The squeeze began exactly 48 hours later. Friday morning arrived with a crisp chill. Diego and his crew had just finished reinforcing the primary load-bearing beams in the basement, securing the foundation enough to keep the city inspectors at bay. I sat at my makeshift desk in the parlor, pulling up my business banking portal on my laptop to transfer their weekly wages. I typed in my password and hit enter. A stark red banner flashed across the screen. Account frozen. Panic flared in my chest. I quickly dialed the commercial banking hotline. After 20 minutes on hold, a monotone customer service representative informed me that a flag for suspicious activity had been placed on my accounts. When I demanded to know who authorized the freeze, the representative nervously cited a directive from their parent company's risk management division. The parent company was a massive Wall Street conglomerate, the exact same conglomerate where Marcus served as a senior vice president. He was choking off my air supply. He had leveraged his corporate influence to freeze every single dollar I had to my name. I had no money to buy food, no money to pay my apartment rent, and worst of all, no money to pay the men sweating in my basement. I walked down the basement stairs, my stomach twisting with shame. I found Diego packing up his heavy tools. I looked him in the eye and confessed that my accounts were locked. I told him I could not pay him his wages for the week. I expected him to pack his truck and walk off the job, leaving the house vulnerable. Instead, Diego wiped his hands on his denim jeans and gave a sharp, dismissive wave. He told me he knew a rat when he saw one, referring to the city inspector from earlier in the week. He promised me his crew would stay and finish the structural reinforcements on credit. His loyalty nearly brought me to tears, but I forced myself to stay completely focused. The financial starvation was phase 1. I knew phase 2 was coming right behind it. The very next afternoon, a sleek black Mercedes SUV rolled up the overgrown gravel driveway. The heavy car door swung open and my mother Patricia stepped out. She looked entirely out of place in her pristine white cashmere coat and designer sunglasses standing against the backdrop of peeling paint and rotting wood. She was carrying 2 large brown paper grocery bags. I stood on the sagging porch watching her navigate the broken steps. She offered a fragile, trembling smile, playing the role of the deeply concerned mother to absolute perfection. "Harper, darling," she cooed, her voice practically dripping with manufactured sympathy. She stepped into the dusty parlor, wrinkling her nose slightly at the smell of ancient timber before setting the heavy bags on my makeshift desk. "I brought you some food. I know things have been terribly difficult for you lately." I kept my expression entirely neutral, remembering Agent Davis and his instructions. I asked her what she was doing here. My mother let out a long, ragged sigh. She reached up and wiped away a single, perfectly timed tear from the corner of her eye. She stepped closer, reaching out to grasp my hands in hers. "Harper, please," she whispered, her voice cracking with manufactured despair. "You have to stop this foolish crusade. Your father is in terrible trouble. His business is completely failing. We are drowning in debt and the creditors are circling us like vultures." I stared at her, forcing myself to look confused and vulnerable. She squeezed my hands tighter, her performance escalating. "If you do not sell this house to Marcus right now, we will lose everything. The bank will seize our home. Your father will go to federal prison for outstanding commercial debts. Marcus is the only one who can bail us out, but he needs the collateral from this property to secure the loan. Please, Harper, do it for the family. Do it for your father." It was a masterful performance. If I had not seen the video of her forcing a pen into my drugged grandmother's hand, I might have actually believed her. I might have felt a shred of pity. She was playing on the last remaining fragments of my childhood loyalty, weaponizing the very concept of family to manipulate me into surrendering the millions hidden in the walls. I lowered my head, acting as though the weight of her words was crushing my spirit. I pulled my hands away from hers and turned toward the grocery bags she had placed on the desk. I reached inside to unpack the food she had supposedly brought out of maternal charity. I pulled out a box of generic pasta, some canned soup, and a loaf of bread. But as I reached the bottom of the thick paper bag, my fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of receipt paper. I pulled the receipt out and smoothed it flat against the wooden desk. I kept my back turned to my mother so she could not see my face. I read the printed text. It was a receipt from an ultra-exclusive artisanal market downtown, time-stamped just 1 hour ago. My mother had not just bought generic soup. The receipt itemized over $2,000 worth of imported beluga caviar, 3 bottles of vintage French champagne, and a pound of white truffles. It was an order clearly meant for a lavish high-society cocktail party. The story about my father facing bankruptcy and prison was a complete, calculated lie. They were celebrating. They were planning a party with the money they stole from my grandmother while standing in my house begging for my pity. My blood ran cold, but a sharp, thrilling sense of clarity immediately followed. This was my opening. This was exactly what the FBI needed. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing a stream of hot tears to spill down my cheeks. I let my shoulders slump perfectly, mimicking the posture of a completely broken, defeated woman. I turned back around to face my mother, clutching the generic box of pasta to my chest. "Okay, Mom," I cried, letting my voice shake with artificial surrender. "I will sign it. Just tell Marcus to bring the contract." A flash of predatory triumph ignited in my mother's eyes, quickly hidden behind a mask of maternal relief. She stepped forward and hugged me tightly, completely unaware that the heavy car key resting in my pocket was actively recording every single word. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind my mother, leaving me alone in the dusty parlor. I immediately pulled the modified key fob from my pocket and walked straight out the back door, slipping through the overgrown garden to the unmarked mobile command center parked in the alleyway behind my property. Agent Davis was waiting inside, surrounded by glowing monitors and 2 technicians wearing heavy headphones. I tossed the key fob onto his metal desk. I told him my mother took the bait completely. Davis plugged the device into a terminal and extracted the audio file. The entire command center listened in absolute silence as my mother spun her fabricated tale of bankruptcy, followed by my perfectly timed surrender. When the recording finished, Davis leaned back in his chair and offered a grim nod of approval. He said the recording established coercion and fraudulent intent, but it was not enough to lock Marcus away for a decade. We needed Marcus himself on the record, confirming the existence of the offshore accounts and the bearer bonds hidden inside the walls. Davis outlined the next phase of our operation. He explained that Marcus freezing my accounts was actually a tactical advantage for us. We were going to use his own weapon against him. Davis instructed me to call Victoria right now. I needed to play the role of the utterly defeated broken sibling who had finally been crushed under the weight of their financial starvation. I had to beg for mercy. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart, and dialed my sister's private cell phone number. The phone rang 3 times before Victoria answered. I could hear the rhythmic humming of a massage chair and the clinking of crystal glasses in the background. She was clearly at a high-end day spa, likely using the very money they had stolen from my grandmother. "Victoria," I gasped, forcing a pathetic, trembling sob into the receiver. "Please, you have to help me." My sister let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Harper, really?" She drawled, her voice dripping with extreme boredom. "I am in the middle of a hot stone treatment. What do you want?" I squeezed my eyes shut, channeling every ounce of genuine frustration I had felt over the past few weeks into a performance of complete despair. I told her I had no money left. I told her the bank had frozen my accounts, my construction crew had walked out, and I could not even afford to buy groceries. I cried into the phone, begging her to tell Marcus to bring the buyout contract. I told her I would sign the house over today. I just wanted the nightmare to end. A cruel, melodic laugh echoed through the phone speaker. Victoria was absolutely reveling in my misery. I knew you would break, Harper, she gloated, her tone dripping with toxic satisfaction. You always were too weak to play in the big leagues. You thought you could outsmart Marcus. You thought you could keep grandmother's legacy all to yourself. I kept up the quiet sobbing, asking her to just send a courier with the paperwork so I could sign it and be done. Oh no. Victoria snapped, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding. You do not get to just sign it in private and slink away like a coward. You made this difficult, Harper. You dragged this out, and now you are going to do exactly what I say. I asked her what she wanted, keeping my voice submissive and weak. The annual foundation gala is this Friday evening, Victoria announced. It is the biggest charity event of the year. Every important family member, every major investor, and all of Marcus's high society friends will be in attendance. You are going to come to the ballroom. You are going to wear whatever shabby, pathetic clothes you have left, and you are going to sign that house over to Marcus in front of the entire family. I protested weakly, acting as though the public humiliation was too much to bear. I begged her not to make me do it in front of everyone. That is the only offer on the table, Victoria countered, her voice turning completely ruthless. You are going to stand up in front of everyone and hand over the deed. I want every single person in that room to see who the real winner is. If you do not show up by 8 o'clock on Friday, Marcus will let the city demolish the house on Monday morning and you will get absolutely nothing. Do we have a deal? I whimpered a quiet, broken confirmation and hung up the phone. I looked up at Agent Davis. He was already pulling up blueprints of the downtown hotel where the gala was being hosted. He looked at me with a cold, determined glint in his eye. He said Victoria had just handed us the perfect stage. The next 48 hours moved with dizzying speed. The FBI team mapped out the entire hotel ballroom, identifying all the entry and exit points, the catering corridors, and the VIP lounges. Because Marcus was a high-profile financial target, Davis warned me that the gala would be crawling with private corporate security. We could not risk sending undercover agents into the main ballroom where they might be recognized by Marcus's security detail. I would have to go in completely alone. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, looming tension. I stood inside the mobile command center, dressed in a simple, outdated black dress that perfectly fit the narrative of a ruined woman. Agent Davis stepped forward carrying a small silver briefcase. He snapped the latches open to reveal an array of highly specialized surveillance equipment. He pulled out a tiny flexible wire microphone and expertly taped it against my collarbone, running the nearly invisible wire down the seam of my dress. Next, he retrieved a stunning antique silver brooch, adorned with a cluster of dark blue sapphires. He pinned it carefully near my neckline. The center sapphire is a microscopic high-definition camera, Davis explained, adjusting the angle of the pin. It feeds a live audio-visual stream directly to this command center. We will see everything you see, and we will hear every word spoken within a 10-foot radius. I looked down at the brooch, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. The reality of the situation was terrifying. I was walking into a room filled with predators armed with nothing but a hidden camera and a script. Davis placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. His gaze was intense and completely unyielding. Remember the objective, Harper. Do not let Victoria distract you with her petty insults. Do not let your mother play the victim. Your only target is Marcus. You need to leverage his massive ego. Make him feel like a god. Play the defeated peasant and stroke his vanity until he cannot help but show off. I nodded, committing the directive to memory. Get Marcus to brag about the money, Davis instructed, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Get him to say the words bearer bonds and offshore accounts on camera. The moment he confirms he knows the money is in the walls of that house, we move in and take them all down. Friday evening arrived with a suffocating heaviness. I stepped out of the rideshare vehicle and looked up at the towering glass facade of the downtown hotel. The annual foundation gala was in full swing. Valets scrambled to park a continuous parade of luxury cars, while high society elites glided through the revolving doors. I adjusted the collar of my simple, understated black dress, feeling the cold, rigid wire taped flat against my skin. The antique sapphire brooch rested perfectly near my neckline, its microscopic camera lens capturing everything in my line of sight. Deep in my ear, A virtually invisible earpiece crackled to life. Agent Davis's voice was a low, steady anchor in my mind. "We have visual." Harper Davis said, his tone strictly professional. "Audio is crystal clear. Walk in there and let them hang themselves." I pushed through the heavy gilded doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The space was a breathtaking display of excessive wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of arrogant networking. I kept my shoulders slumped, my gaze cast slightly downward, perfectly embodying the broken, defeated woman they expected to see. Before I could even reach the edge of the crowd, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned to find my father William blocking my path. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that easily cost more than a month of Diego's wages. He looked me up and down, his eyes scanning my simple dress with visible disdain. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive gin. "Don't eat too much of the buffet, Harper." He sneered, his voice loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "I know you can't afford a meal like this anymore." I forced a look of pure humiliation onto my face, biting my lower lip as if fighting back tears. The sapphire brooch was pointed directly at his chest, recording every ounce of his cruel condescension. "I am just here to sign the papers, Dad," I whispered, keeping my voice small and desperate. Right on cue, my mother materialized beside him. Patricia was dripping in diamonds, holding a crystal flute of champagne. She linked her arm through my father's and offered a theatrical, pitying sigh. She turned her head slightly toward a group of wealthy socialites standing nearby, ensuring her voice carried effortlessly over the classical music playing in the background. "She always was the charity case of the family," Patricia declared in a loud stage whisper. "We cut her off years ago, but she keeps coming back for handouts." The socialites offered polite, uncomfortable chuckles, glancing at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. Patricia took a sip of her champagne and continued her public execution. Even when she was younger, she just never had Victoria's drive. We paid for the best tutors, the best schools, and she insisted on playing in the dirt with those useless architectural preservation projects. Now look at her, crawling back to us because her little construction fantasy went bankrupt. I absorbed the verbal blows, letting my silence validate her lies. This was nothing new. My mind flashed back to the day I received my acceptance letter to the university's historical preservation program. I had run into the kitchen practically vibrating with excitement, only to find my parents toasting Victoria's entry into a cutthroat corporate investment firm. My father had taken my acceptance letter, skimmed it for 2 seconds, and tossed it straight into the trash can, telling me that old buildings did not generate profit and that I was completely wasting my potential. They had spent my entire life conditioning me to feel inferior, using every family dinner as a stage to highlight Victoria's financial conquests, while treating my passion as a juvenile, expensive hobby. They wanted me to break under the weight of public shame tonight. They wanted me to feel the exact same crushing inadequacy I had felt at 18. But this time, the dynamic had shifted entirely. They had no idea that their arrogant cruelty was currently broadcasting directly to a federal command center filled with agents cataloging every single word. "Just point me to Marcus," I said, my voice trembling perfectly as I stared at the polished marble floor. "I do not want to cause a scene. I just want this to be over so I can go home." Patricia smiled, a terrifyingly cold expression of absolute victory. "Oh, you are not causing a scene, darling," she cooed, her eyes flashing with malice. "You are the evening's main entertainment." The crowd suddenly parted, rippling like water to make way for the man of the hour. Marcus strode into view. He looked like a king surveying his conquered territory. He wore a midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket exuding power, arrogance, and absolute control. In his left hand, he held a crystal glass of amber scotch. In his right hand, he carried a thick leather-bound legal contract. He stopped directly in front of me, his tall frame looming over my intentionally hunched posture. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, letting the silence stretch to ensure he had the attention of everyone in our immediate circle. A predatory smirk curled the corners of his mouth. Ready to surrender, sister-in-law? I stared at the thick legal contract in his hand, letting my shoulders cave inward. Yes, I whispered, keeping my voice barely above a raspy breath. I surrender. Just please give me the pen and let me go. Marcus let out a deep, booming laugh that turned heads at the adjacent tables. He patted my shoulder with mocking affection, his heavy gold watch flashing under the crystal chandeliers. Not out here in the hallway, Harper, he said, gesturing toward the center of the room with his scotch glass. We are going to do this properly, at the family table, right where everyone can see you finally give up. He turned and walked away, fully expecting me to follow like an obedient dog. I fell into step behind him, keeping my head bowed. The hidden earpiece crackled instantly. Agent Davis's voice was sharp and clear. You are doing perfectly, Harper. The camera feed is completely stable. Keep him talking. We need him to implicate the parents and explicitly mention the hidden bearer bonds. Marcus led me through the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. He bypassed the general seating and brought me directly to a raised VIP booth overlooking the dance floor. The private family table was overflowing with champagne buckets and exorbitant floral centerpieces. Victoria sat at the center of the plush velvet booth, holding a martini glass. When she saw me approach, her eyes lit up with predatory glee. My parents flanked her, looking incredibly smug as they watched my orchestrated walk of shame. Take a seat, Sister Victoria commanded, pointing a manicured finger at the empty chair directly across from Marcus. You look absolutely dreadful, by the way. I suppose poverty does not suit your complexion. I ignored her insult and pulled out the heavy mahogany chair. I sat down carefully, ensuring the sapphire brooch pinned to my neckline had an unobstructed dead-center view of Marcus across the table. He tossed the contract down in front of me. The thick stack of papers landed with a heavy final thud. He placed a sleek silver fountain pen right on top of the signature line. Sign it, Marcus ordered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The deed to the Elm Street property transfers to my holding company, effective immediately. You waive all rights to contest the demolition, and in exchange my risk management division lifts the freeze on your pathetic little business accounts. You can go back to scraping by and we can all move on with our lives. I reached out with a trembling hand, letting my fingers brush the cold metal of the pen. I did not pick it up. Instead, I looked up at Marcus, letting large, welling tears pool in my eyes. I needed to play the victim perfectly. I needed to feed his massive, towering ego. I just do not understand, Marcus, I said, letting my voice crack with manufactured heartbreak. Grandma loved me. She trusted me with everything. How did you get her to sign over the entire $4.5 million to your firm instead of me? My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My father shot Marcus a nervous glance, clearly worried about discussing the money in such a crowded room. But Marcus was completely intoxicated by his own perceived victory. The music was loud, the champagne was flowing, and the woman who had dared to defy him was currently crying at his table. He felt utterly invincible. Marcus chuckled, taking the bait hook, line, and sinker. He leaned in close across the table, his face filling the frame of my hidden camera. You think Wall Street respects love? He asked, his voice dripping with condescension. I grew up with nothing, fighting my way to the top of the financial food chain as a black man in a white man's world. I learned how to be ruthless long before I met your ridiculous family. He took a long sip of his scotch, the alcohol loosening his tongue exactly as Agent Davis had predicted. Your parents were greedy enough to sedate the old bat. He continued, pointing a casual finger at my mother and father. Patricia and William did all the dirty work. They kept her drugged out of her mind so she could barely hold a pen. And I was smart enough to launder the stolen $4.5 million directly through my Cayman accounts. You never stood a chance, Harper. You were playing a child's game while we were executing a corporate takeover. The earpiece crackled. We have the wire transfer confession, Davis said, his voice tight with adrenaline. Now get him to confirm the bonds in the walls. Close the trap. I wiped a fake tear from my cheek. But why do you need my house? I whimpered, staring at the contract. You already took her liquid fortune. Why go to all this trouble just to freeze my bank accounts over a rotting Victorian teardown? Marcus rolled his eyes, utterly annoyed by my perceived stupidity. Because the old woman was paranoid, he sneered, leaning even closer until I could smell the sharp alcohol on his breath. Before we could drain her dry, she liquidated her best stock portfolios into untraceable bearer bonds and offshore account ledgers. We know exactly where she put them. They are sealed inside the walls of that house. Once you sign this contract, my demolition crew brings that rotting structure to the ground on Monday morning, and I pull millions of dollars straight out of the rubble completely untaxed. He tapped the silver pen with his index finger. Now stop crying and sign the paper. We have champagne to drink. In my ear, Agent Davis gave the final command. That is a bingo. We have everything. I looked down at the heavy legal document. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The tears dried up. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. I picked up the silver fountain pen, feeling its solid weight between my fingers. I looked up at Marcus, then at Victoria, and finally at my parents. The look of utter defeat was gone from my face. I smiled softly, a genuine expression of absolute, unadulterated victory. I pressed the pen to the heavy parchment paper. I did not sign my name. I moved the pen in broad, deliberate strokes across the designated signature line. I signed it Elder Abuse. Marcus stared at the wet ink on the heavy parchment paper. His brain seemed to short-circuit as he tried to process the cursive letters. The smug, predatory grin that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago slid off, entirely replaced by a dark, terrifying scowl. He blinked, leaning closer to the document, as if hoping the words would miraculously rearrange themselves into my legal signature. They did not. The phrase, elder abuse, sat right on the dotted line, a glaring monument to his impending destruction. His head snapped up. His eyes, previously dancing with arrogant amusement, were now wide with genuine shock. He looked at me, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle ticked frantically in his cheek. The crystal glass in his hand shook, the amber scotch sloshing violently against the rim. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a dangerous, guttural hiss that barely concealed the panic rising in his chest. I pushed back from this table. The heavy mahogany chair scraped loudly against the polished marble floor before tipping backward and crashing to the ground. The sharp, violent sound echoed like a gunshot through the opulent space. The string quartet playing softly on the nearby stage abruptly stopped mid-note. The sudden, suffocating silence in the grand ballroom was absolutely deafening. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned away from their caviar and champagne, shifting their collective gaze directly toward our elevated VIP booth. "It means I am not selling you the house, Marcus," I said, projecting my voice so it carried clearly across the hushed, glittering room. "And it means Grandma was not as crazy as you thought." The color drained entirely from Marcus's face. He glanced nervously around the ballroom, suddenly hyper-aware of the elite corporate peers, wealthy investors, and high society gossips hanging onto my every word. The invincible titan of Wall Street was crumbling in real time. He lunged forward, slamming his hands flat onto the table, leaning in to intimidate me. "Keep your voice down, you stupid girl," he snarled under his breath, his eyes darting frantically toward the crowd. "You're making a fool of yourself. You have no idea who you are messing with. I will ruin you." But the panic was already spreading. Victoria leaped to her feet, her chair screeching against the marble. In her haste, she knocked over her martini glass. The clear liquid spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking directly into the fraudulent contract Marcus had brought. She was absolutely horrified by the public spectacle, her carefully curated, flawless high society image shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "Harper, shut your mouth this instant!" Victoria shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You are ruining my gala. You are ruining my night. Security. Someone get security up here right now to remove my sister. She is having a severe psychotic break. She is completely delusional." My father stood up next, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to physically assert dominance. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You ungrateful little wretch!" William spat out, his face mottled with rage and embarrassment. "We gave you a chance. We gave you an opportunity to walk away from your pathetic, bankrupt life with some dignity, and you pull this humiliating stunt in front of my primary investors. You are a disgrace to this family." I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into the timid, compliant scapegoat they had spent my entire life conditioning me to be. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, feeling the comforting weight of the sapphire brooch pinned near my collarbone. I knew Agent Davis and his entire federal team were sitting in the mobile command center, capturing every single second of this meltdown. The FBI tactical units were likely already moving into the hotel lobbies, securing the exits. I just needed to hold the line. I just needed to keep them exposing their true venomous colors to the room. My mother could no longer contain her seething rage. Patricia's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The woman who had spent my entire existence caring infinitely more about her country club status than her youngest daughter felt her absolute control slipping away. She could not handle the dozens of wealthy socialites whispering behind their manicured hands, watching her family implode on the main stage. "How dare you speak to us this way?" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with fury. She lunged forward around the edge of the table, her diamond tennis bracelets flashing under the massive crystal chandeliers. She raised her right hand high into the air, aiming a vicious, open-handed slap directly at my face. She fully intended to physically silence me, to strike me down, and put me back in my designated place right in front of the entire elite crowd. But she severely underestimated me. Years of hauling heavy lumber, pulling down drywall, and climbing restoration scaffolding had given me physical strength she could not even fathom. I moved with lightning speed. I reached up and caught her wrist midair. Her hand stopped dead just inches from my cheek. Patricia gasped, her eyes widening in absolute shock that I had dared to block her strike, that I was physically overpowering her. She tried to yank her arm back, but my grip was like an iron vice. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a deadly, unwavering calm. I stepped closer, leaning in so the hidden microphone in my brooch picked up every single syllable I was about to deliver. The entire ballroom held its breath, watching the golden family of the financial world stand completely paralyzed by the daughter they had discarded. "Grandma hid a camera in her room," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact with my mother as the blood drained from her perfectly contoured face. "I found the safe hidden in the basement behind the old boiler. I have seen the videos of you drugging her." The words hung in the dead air of the ballroom, sharper than any blade. Patricia's hand, still locked in my iron grip, went completely limp. The heavy diamond tennis bracelet slid down her wrist with a hollow clatter. I let go, and her arm dropped to her side like a dead weight. The absolute, unadulterated terror that washed over my mother's face was a masterpiece of human panic. The perfectly applied layers of expensive makeup could not hide the sudden ashen pallor of her skin. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast she looked like a walking corpse. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick carpet of the VIP booth, until she collided with the mahogany table. William choked on his next breath. His mouth opened and closed silently, his aggressive posture collapsing as the reality of my statement pierced his alcohol-fueled confidence. He looked frantically at Marcus, seeking some kind of lifeline, some legal loophole to cling to. But Marcus was paralyzed. The invincible Wall Street titan stood entirely frozen, his eyes blown wide with sudden realization. The crystal glass of expensive scotch slipped right through his numb fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, sending amber liquid and shards of glass exploding across the polished surface. That shattering sound finally broke the spell holding the room hostage. A low, chaotic murmur erupted from the crowd of elites gathered around our booth. High society gossips and corporate investors leaned in, their eyes darting between my furious stance and my crumbling family. Victoria began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved dramatically beneath her custom silk gown as the sheer magnitude of the situation crashed down upon her. She looked at her diamond rings, her couture dress, her wealthy husband, suddenly understanding that her entire luxurious existence was constructed on a foundation of massive federal felonies. She grabbed Marcus by the lapel of his velvet jacket, her manicured nails digging into the fabric. She demanded that he fix this, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill pitch. She pleaded with him to use his offshore accounts to call his lawyers to silence me before I ruined her perfect night. Marcus violently ripped his jacket from her grasp, shoving his wife away with a look of pure disgust. He was no longer the arrogant king of the ballroom. He was a cornered rat, desperately calculating his own survival. He knew that if I had the videos, I had the exact dates, the times, and the undeniable proof of his conspiracy. William, however, was not ready to surrender his empire. He had spent decades manipulating the narrative, controlling the boardroom, and gaslighting anyone who dared to question his authority. He glanced around the ballroom, seeing the dozens of cell phones now raised in the air, recording the spectacular implosion of his family. He swallowed hard, plastering a fake booming laugh across his face. He stepped in front of Patricia, shielding her trembling body from the onlookers, and turned to face his wealthy peers. He clapped his hands together, forcing a jovial, commanding tone that echoed through the vast space. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate interruption," William announced, sweeping his arm toward me with a look of exaggerated paternal sorrow. "Please return to your champagne. This is nothing more than a private family tragedy spilling into public view." He turned his back to me, completely addressing the crowd, as if I were merely an unruly child throwing a tantrum. "My daughter is mentally unstable," he declared, his voice ringing with practiced sympathy. "We have tried everything to help her, but she refuses treatment. Her construction business went bankrupt, and the stress has caused a severe psychotic break. She is having a terrible episode. She does not know what she is saying." The crowd hesitated, murmuring amongst themselves. Some lowered their phones, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing what they now believed was a tragic mental health crisis. William seized the momentum. He locked eyes with the heavily armed private security guards stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom. He snapped his fingers, gesturing sharply toward me. "Security, remove her immediately," William ordered, his tone returning to that of a ruthless corporate dictator. "Take her out through the service elevator. Do not let her harass our guests any longer." 4 massive security guards in dark suits moved forward, parting the crowd with aggressive efficiency. They approached the raised VIP booth, their hands reaching out to grab my arms and drag me away. I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, my chin held high. I tapped the antique sapphire brooch resting near my collarbone, sending a silent signal to Agent Davis in the mobile command center parked in the alleyway. Just as the lead security guard reached out to grab my shoulder, the ballroom plunged into absolute darkness. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. The massive crystal chandeliers clicked off instantly. The ambient classical music died with a sharp, whining screech of audio feedback. Panic rippled through the hundreds of guests as they blindly bumped into one another in the pitch-black room. Then the massive projector screens flanking the main stage roared to life. These screens were originally designated to play a carefully edited, highly sanitized slideshow of Victoria's supposed charity work. They were meant to display glowing images of my sister handing oversized checks to orphanages. Instead, the brilliant white light of the projectors pierced the darkness, illuminating the terrified faces of my family. The FBI had successfully hijacked the hotel's entire audio-visual system. A grainy high-definition video filled the massive 20-foot screens. The date and timestamp blinked in the bottom right corner, establishing the exact timeline of the crime. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, horrifying silence as the footage began to play. It was a direct feed from the hidden camera my grandmother had installed in her antique armoire. The gigantic screens displayed my grandmother lying weakly in her bed, her breathing shallow and labored. The bedroom door creaked open on the screen, and 2 figures stepped into the frame. The high-quality resolution left absolutely no room for denial. It was Patricia and William. The hundreds of elite guests watched in collective disgust as my mother leaned over the bed. They watched her crush a handful of heavy sedatives into a glass of water. They watched my father physically hold his own mother down, forcing the drugged liquid down her throat, while she weakly protested. The audio from the video echoed through the ballroom speakers, amplifying my mother's cold, ruthless voice as she told William to hold her head steady so she would sign the power of attorney documents. The undeniable, grotesque reality of their greed was suddenly broadcast to the entire city's elite. There was no deflection left. There was no gaslighting away the truth, playing on a 20-foot loop above their heads. The charity case they had mocked all evening had just dropped a federal guillotine on their entire empire. A collective gasp of absolute horror ripped through the ballroom, shattering the stunned silence like breaking glass. Hundreds of high society guests, corporate titans, and wealthy investors stared upward in pure, unadulterated shock. The high-definition video playing on the massive 20-foot screens left absolutely nothing to the imagination. The crystal-clear audio echoed through the room, bouncing off the gilded walls. Every single person watched Patricia, dressed in one of her expensive cashmere cardigans, standing over my grandmother's bedside table. The camera caught the precise moment she took a heavy marble paperweight and ruthlessly crushed a handful of prescription sedatives into a fine white powder. The crowd watched completely paralyzed as Patricia callously swept the powder into a cup of chamomile tea and stirred it with a silver spoon. A prominent bank CEO, standing just a few feet from our VIP booth, actually dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, but nobody even looked down. Every eye remained glued to the screens as William entered the frame. My father, the man who had just stood in front of this very crowd and falsely claimed I was having a psychotic break, was now being broadcast committing a brutal felony. The video showed William approaching the bed. My grandmother looked frail, her eyes glassy and unfocused, from the heavily drugged tea Patricia had just forced her to drink. William did not show an ounce of compassion. He grabbed her thin, trembling wrist with terrifying aggression. The audio picked up his harsh barking demands, telling her to stop fighting and just hold the pen. The entire ballroom watched in collective disgust as my father physically pinned her hand to the legal pad, forcing her fingers to drag the pen across the dotted line, transferring millions of dollars into Marcus's control. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and devastating. The elite social circle that Patricia and William had spent decades cultivating, the very people they had desperately tried to impress by stepping on my neck, physically recoiled. Women in couture gowns literally backed away from our table, pulling their husbands with them as if my parents carried a lethal plague. Whispers of disgust and outrage swept through the crowd like wildfire. At the center of the VIP booth, the illusion of the flawless golden family disintegrated into ash. Patricia stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared up at her own monstrous actions playing on loop. William frantically looked around, searching for a friendly face, an ally, anyone who would listen to another lie. He found nothing but cold, judging stares and dozens of cell phones recording his utter humiliation. While my parents drowned in the reality of their public execution, Marcus was already running a rapid, cold-blooded risk assessment. His brilliant financial mind, the exact tool he had used to build his ruthless empire and launder my grandmother's stolen fortune, instantly calculated the sheer magnitude of the disaster. This was not a civil dispute over a real estate deed. This was documented, undeniable elder abuse, extortion, and massive federal fraud. The bearer bonds hidden in the walls of my Victorian house were no longer a golden ticket. They were radioactive evidence. Victoria turned to her husband, her face streaked with ruined mascara and tears of absolute panic. She grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his velvet tuxedo jacket, her manicured nails digging frantically into the expensive fabric. She begged him to call his legal team to use his offshore leverage to somehow buy their way out of this nightmare. She shrieked that they were going to lose the country club memberships, the yachts, and their entire social standing. She pleaded with him to protect her. Marcus looked down at his wife with eyes completely devoid of human warmth. Wall Street did not respect love, and Marcus certainly did not respect dead weight. He ripped Victoria's hands off his jacket, shoving her backward with such force that she crashed into William. "I am not going to prison for your incompetent, greedy parents." Marcus snarled, his voice a low, venomous hiss that only our table could hear. Without a second backward glance, Marcus abandoned his wife and his in-laws to face the furious mob. He turned his back on the screens and began to move. He did not run. Running would attract immediate security attention, but he walked with a fast, determined, predatory stride. He slipped off his velvet jacket and tossed it onto a passing waiter's tray, seamlessly blending into the chaotic, shifting crowd. I watched him go, making absolutely no move to stop him. The hidden earpiece in my ear clicked twice, confirming that the tactical units tracking my camera feed had a visual on his exact location. Marcus expertly navigated the perimeter of the grand ballroom, avoiding the panicked guests and the bewildered catering staff. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen as he desperately tried to initiate a massive wire transfer, attempting to dump the Cayman account funds into an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. He needed a private jet. He needed to be in a non-extradition country before the sun came up. He pushed through a set of heavy swinging doors, leaving the opulent, screaming ballroom behind. He entered the stark, fluorescent-lit service corridor. The air here smelled of industrial bleach and discarded catering food. Marcus sprinted down the long, narrow hallway, his expensive dress shoes slapping loudly against the concrete floor. He bypassed the service elevators, knowing they could be easily shut down remotely. He headed straight for the emergency exit at the very end of the corridor, his eyes fixed on this glowing red sign that promised immediate access to the dark alleyway and freedom. He reached the heavy metal doors. He did not even bother to look back. He slammed both of his hands against the crash bar, shoving his entire body weight forward to burst out into the cool night air. The heavy metal doors flew open, banging violently against the exterior brick wall. Marcus took one step outside and completely froze. The alleyway was bathed in the harsh, blinding glare of tactical strobe lights. Agent Davis stood directly in the center of the doorway, his gold FBI badge shining brilliantly under the stark illumination. He was flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear, their weapons resting at the ready. The alley was entirely sealed off by black unmarked federal vehicles. Marcus stared at the blockade, his cell phone slipping from his grasp and shattering against the concrete pavement. The massive wire transfer he had been trying to initiate died on the broken screen. "Going somewhere?" Mr. Marcus Agent Davis asked, stepping forward with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs glinting in his hands. "Going somewhere, Mr. Marcus." Marcus attempted to step backward, desperate to retreat into the safety of the service corridor, but the heavy metal fire door clicked shut behind him, sealing him in the dark alleyway. The cold night wind bit sharply through his sweat-soaked silk shirt. He opened his mouth to deploy his usual corporate intimidation tactics, to threaten massive lawsuits, to demand badge numbers, to scream about his high-powered legal team. The arrogant words died instantly in his throat. Agent Davis stepped forward out of the shadows, his heavy tactical boots crunching loudly on the shattered glass of Marcus's dropped cell phone. The federal agent did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He lunged forward, grabbing Marcus violently by the shoulder. He spun the invincible Wall Street titan around and slammed him chest first against the rough, cold brick wall. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed loudly over the distant, terrifying wail of approaching police sirens. Inside the grand ballroom, the situation was rapidly deteriorating into absolute, unmanageable pandemonium. The heavy gold-plated doors at the main entrance burst open with enough force to crack the surrounding decorative drywall. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents flooded into the opulent room. Their dark tactical vests, heavy utility belts, and flashing silver badges stood out violently against the glittering sea of pastel couture gowns and tailored silk tuxedos. The emergency lights flared to life, casting a harsh, unforgiving, rotating glare over the once glamorous charity event. "Nobody move!" A voice boomed over a high-powered bullhorn, cutting cleanly through the shrieks of the panicked socialites. "Federal agents, stay exactly where you are and keep your hands visible." The elite guests, the billionaire investors, the corporate executives, and the society columnists who had spent the entire evening sipping vintage champagne and judging my lack of wealth, instantly transformed into a ravenous pack of paparazzi. Hundreds of smartphones shot up into the air simultaneously. The bright flashes of phone cameras illuminated the elevated VIP booth like a continuous blinding lightning storm. They were relentlessly capturing every agonizing second of the Golden family's catastrophic downfall. Patricia completely lost her mind. The perfectly manicured, icy matriarch of the country club shattered into a hysterical, sobbing, unrecognizable mess. She shrieked a high-pitched, desperate, terrifying sound that grated against the ears. She scrambled backward, her designer heels slipping dangerously on the spilled alcohol coating the polished marble floor. She desperately tried to wedge her body behind William, clawing frantically at the back of his tailored suit jacket, attempting to physically hide her face from the relentless glare of the recording cell phones. "Do not look at me!" Patricia wailed, burying her face into William's shoulder and trembling violently. "Stop filming. William, make them stop filming us. We are respectable people. You cannot do this to us." William tried desperately to salvage whatever pathetic scraps of authority he had left. He puffed out his chest, attempting to block the advancing federal agents with his imposing physical stature. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, wearing the fake authoritative smile he usually reserved for hostile corporate board meetings. "Now let us all just calm down," William said, his voice trembling violently, despite his best efforts to project quiet confidence. "There has clearly been a massive administrative error here. I am personal friends with the district attorney. I demand to speak with the agent in charge immediately. This is a private charity gala, and you are illegally trespassing on rented property." The sea of guests parted like the Red Sea as Agent Davis strode back into the ballroom. He was not alone. Two massive federal agents marched right behind him, tightly gripping Marcus by his handcuffed arms. The undisputed king of the financial sector was now being paraded through the center of the room in steel cuffs, his expensive dress shirt wrinkled, untucked, and stained with alleyway dirt. The guests gasped collectively, the whispers escalating into a deafening, echoing roar as they witnessed the titan of finance being handled like a common street criminal. Agent Davis ignored William's pathetic corporate bluster entirely. He marched straight up to the VIP booth, his cold eyes locked onto my parents. He pulled a thick stack of folded warrants from his tactical vest and slammed them down onto the mahogany table right next to the ruined champagne-soaked contract they had just tried to force me to sign. "William and Patricia, you are under arrest for elder financial abuse forgery and wire fraud," Agent Davis announced loudly, his voice projecting clearly and carrying across the hushed, captivated audience. William's jaw dropped. The last remaining remnants of color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand a lawyer, but an agent was already moving in, grabbing his wrists and wrenching them forcefully behind his back. Patricia screamed hysterically as another agent took her arm. She thrashed wildly, her expensive diamond earrings catching the harsh emergency lights as she fought against the firm, unyielding grip of the federal officers. "This is a setup!" Patricia shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy, sweaty strands across her face. "My daughter did this to us. She is a liar. We were only trying to protect my mother's estate. You cannot arrest us. We belong to the yacht club. We are donors." Her frantic, wildly elitist protests only fueled the recording guests. They zoomed in, capturing every single tear, every unhinged scream, every ounce of their profound, inescapable humiliation. The untouchable family was being dragged through the public mud of their own making, and the entire city was watching it happen live. Through the absolute chaos, Victoria stood entirely frozen. Her eyes darted wildly from her screaming mother to her handcuffed father, and finally to her husband. The brutal reality of her shattered life finally bypassed her stubborn denial. Her luxury cars, her penthouse apartments, her endless shopping sprees, her social standing, everything she owned was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She let out a guttural, terrifying sob and lunged forward. Pushing past the agents securing the VIP booth, she ran directly to Marcus. She grabbed his arm, dark tears ruining her flawless makeup and dripping onto her expensive couture gown. "Marcus, do something," Victoria cried out, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered desperation. "Call your lawyers. Fix this. You have billions of dollars in offshore accounts. You know people in the government. You promised me we were protected. Fix this right now. Tell them it is a mistake." Marcus did not comfort her. He did not offer warm reassurances or whisper promises of high-priced legal defense teams. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. His expression was chillingly cold. His eyes were dead calculating and completely devoid of any affection or loyalty. The gears in his brilliant, ruthless financial mind were spinning at lightning speed. He looked at the undeniable video evidence still looping silently on the massive screens above them. He looked at my parents being forcefully dragged toward the exit in handcuffs. And then he looked at Victoria, seeing her not as his beloved partner, but as a severe toxic liability. Marcus realized in that exact moment that his money could not buy his way out of federal wire fraud and elder abuse charges, backed by high-definition video evidence. The Golden Empire had fallen completely. He realized his only possible way out, his only chance at avoiding decades in a maximum security federal prison, was to offer the FBI a substantial plea deal. He would have to sell out every single person in this room, starting with the sobbing woman clinging to his arm. Marcus backed away, his custom Italian leather shoes scraping against the cold, damp concrete of the alleyway. The blinding strobe lights from the tactical vehicles painted his face in stark flashing white and black, illuminating the absolute panic hiding behind his eyes. He looked at the dozen heavily armed agents blocking his only path to freedom. The ruthless survival instinct that had propelled him to the top of the financial food chain kicked into overdrive. He did not beg. He did not cower. He simply ran the numbers. The video evidence playing inside the ballroom was undeniable. The offshore wire transfers were already being tracked by federal cyber divisions. The entire operation was compromised. There was exactly one variable left for him to manipulate, and that was the allocation of blame. Before Marcus could open his mouth to negotiate his surrender, the heavy metal fire doors burst open behind him. Victoria stumbled out into the harsh glare of the alleyway, shivering in the freezing night air. Her custom silk gown was stained with spilled wine, and her perfectly styled hair clung to her tear-soaked cheeks. She threw herself at Marcus, wrapping her arms around his waist with frantic, suffocating desperation. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably, completely oblivious to the federal agents surrounding them. "Marcus, please!" Victoria wailed, her voice echoing shrilly off the brick walls. "You have to fix this. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them my parents did not know what they were doing. Call your legal team. You promised me we were untouchable. You promised me nothing would ever happen to us." Marcus looked down at the woman he had married. There was no affection in his eyes. There was no sympathy. There was only the cold, hard calculation of a man assessing a depreciating asset. He raised his hands, gripped Victoria by the shoulders, and violently shoved her backward with terrifying force. Victoria gasped, stumbling over her high heels and falling hard onto the rough pavement. She scraped her palms against the concrete, tearing the delicate skin. She looked up at her husband in absolute, uncomprehending shock, her chest heaving as she struggled to understand what was happening. Marcus ignored her completely. He squared his shoulders, adjusted his wrinkled silk shirt, and looked directly into the eyes of Agent Davis. He shifted instantly from a fleeing criminal into a cooperative corporate witness. "I want full immunity," Marcus stated loudly, his voice echoing with the absolute authority of a boardroom dictator negotiating a hostile takeover. "I will give you the Cayman routing numbers. I will hand over the encrypted ledgers, the offshore shell company names, and the exact timestamps of every single transaction dating back to the beginning of the conspiracy." Victoria let out a strangled, breathless choke from the ground. She stared at the man she loved, the man who had promised her a life of unimaginable luxury, as he methodically sold her out to save his own skin. Patricia and William masterminded the whole thing. Marcus continued, his tone clinical and detached, as if he were simply reading a quarterly earnings report to his shareholders. "They approached me with the forged documents. They drugged the old woman. They orchestrated the entire transfer of wealth from start to finish. I have emails and recorded phone calls proving they initiated the conspiracy. Victoria helped wire the money through her personal charity accounts to bypass the initial tax flags. I was just acting as their broker. I was merely facilitating a transaction for my clients based on the paperwork they provided." The silence in the alleyway was absolute, broken only by the crackle of federal radios and the low hum of the tactical vehicles. Agent Davis did not blink. He stared at Marcus with a mixture of professional stoicism and profound disgust, taking in the full measure of the man's cowardice. Victoria remained on the ground, the rough concrete biting into her bare knees. Her chest heaved. Her perfect, meticulously curated life was flashing before her eyes, burning down to ashes. The sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, the private jets, the exclusive country club memberships, the smug superiority she had lorded over me for my entire existence, it was all gone. But the deepest, most agonizing realization was the absolute betrayal of her marriage. Marcus did not love her. He had never loved her. She was nothing more than a convenient, gullible pawn in his grand financial scheme, a stepping stone to my grandmother's millions. He was discarding her the exact same way her family had always discarded me. A sound erupted from Victoria's throat. It was not a cry of sadness. It was a guttural, terrifying scream of absolute agony. The golden child, the flawless, untouchable socialite, completely shattered. Her psychological break was instantaneous and violent. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive gown tearing on the pavement. She lunged at Marcus like a wild animal. All her polished elegance, all her high society training vanished in a single feral instant. She threw herself at him, her hands curling into claws as she aimed directly for his face. "You lying, treacherous monster!" Victoria shrieked, her voice tearing her vocal cords. "I gave you everything. We gave you everything." She collided with him, her nails raking deeply across his cheek, drawing bright red lines of blood. Marcus yelled in pain, raising his arms to shield his face, but Victoria was relentless. She kicked, scratched, and bit, fighting with the unrestrained fury of someone who had just lost their entire world. She tore his silk shirt, her diamond engagement ring catching on the fabric and ripping it to shreds. The federal agents did not hesitate. 3 heavily armed tactical officers swarmed the struggling couple. They grabbed Victoria by the arms, dragging her off the bleeding Wall Street titan. She thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities, her high heels kicking out blindly in a desperate attempt to inflict more damage. "Take her down," one of the agents shouted. They forced Victoria to the cold concrete. They pinned her arms behind her back, pressing her cheek against the gritty pavement. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists with a sharp, terrifying finality. The sound seemed to echo off the alley walls, sealing her fate. "Get her up," Agent Davis commanded, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. The officers hauled the sobbing, hysterical woman to her feet. Her designer dress was ruined, covered in dirt and engine oil. Her flawless hair was a tangled, wild mess. She was hyperventilating, choking on her own tears as they marched her toward the waiting federal transport vans. As they dragged her past the open fire doors, I stepped out into the alleyway. Victoria locked eyes with me. There was no superiority left in her gaze. There was no smug, golden child arrogance. There was only the raw, pathetic terror of a woman realizing she was about to spend the best years of her life in a federal penitentiary. She watched helplessly as the officers hauled her away, handcuffing her alongside Patricia and William in the back of the armored van. As Victoria was shoved into the cramped metal holding area of the federal transport vehicle, the absolute reality of the situation finally seemed to register with my mother. Patricia was already sitting on the hard metal bench inside the armored van next to William, her wrists securely bound behind her back in heavy steel. William sat completely broken, his expensive tuxedo jacket ripped, and his head hanging between his knees in profound, silent shame. He was no longer the imposing patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist. But Patricia was not finished fighting. As she watched her golden child thrown in beside her, she let out a visceral shriek. She scrambled forward, kicking out wildly, and throwing her body toward the open back doors of the vehicle. She tumbled out of the van, landing heavily on her knees on the rough concrete of the alleyway before the federal agents could catch her. The blinding flashes of paparazzi cameras and aggressive cell phone lights spilled out from the grand ballroom and flooded the alleyway. The elite socialites had abandoned their vintage champagne and followed the spectacle outside, eager to consume every single drop of the Golden family's destruction. Handcuffed, weeping, and kneeling on the dirty pavement, Patricia stopped fighting the agents and instead locked her frantic, venomous eyes onto me. The flashing strobe lights from the police cruisers illuminated the streaks of ruined mascara running down her cheeks. "How could you do this to your own family?" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical manufactured agony. "We gave you life. We clothed you. We put a roof over your head. You ungrateful, malicious little girl. You are tearing your own flesh and blood apart." The surrounding crowd of wealthy guests fell completely silent, their cell phones still raised high, eager to record my reaction. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer her the dramatic screaming match she desperately wanted to validate her victimhood. I walked slowly toward her, the crisp night air cooling the lingering adrenaline in my veins. I closed the distance between us and knelt down on the cold asphalt, bringing my face perfectly level with hers. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had spent my entire existence making me feel entirely worthless. "You did not give me a family," I said, my voice steady, cold, and loud enough for the recording devices to capture every single syllable. "You gave me a lifetime of conditional love and toxic abuse. You gave me a prison of impossible standards and endless cruelty. You gave me a childhood filled with constant reminders that I would never be as golden, as perfect, or as ruthless as Victoria. You demanded absolute loyalty while offering nothing but harsh judgment and isolation in return." Patricia blinked, her breath hitching as my words cut cleanly through her theatrical sobbing. "Grandma was the only actual family I ever had." I continued, leaning in slightly closer so she could not escape my gaze. "She was the only person who saw my worth without a price tag attached. She loved me without requiring a massive return on her investment. You saw her vulnerability and treated her like a bank account to be drained." Patricia opened her mouth to argue, to deploy another familiar guilt trip, to twist the narrative one last time for the cameras, but I did not let her speak. I held her gaze, refusing to let her look away from the absolute ruin of her own making. "And for the record, Patricia," I said, emphasizing her first name rather than calling her mother, "I did not destroy you today. I did not force you to commit federal crimes. I did not make you steal from an elderly woman who trusted you. You destroyed yourselves the exact moment you took that marble paperweight, crushed those sedatives, and poured those pills into her tea. You traded your freedom and your precious social standing for an inheritance you never deserved. You built this trap with your own greed, and now you get to live in it." My words struck her like a physical blow. The last remnants of her aggressive defiance vanished, replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that she could not manipulate her way out of this reality. She let out a weak, pathetic sob, her chin dropping to her chest. There were no more lies to spin. The elite audience she had catered to her entire life was actively filming her ultimate humiliation. "Get them out of here," Agent Davis ordered from somewhere behind me. The federal agents hauled Patricia back to her feet without a shred of gentleness. They dragged her toward the transport van, her designer gown dragging through the dirty puddles and discarded trash of the alleyway. The police shoved her inside, pushing her onto the metal bench right next to William and Victoria. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a resounding, definitive clank that echoed loudly over the wailing sirens. The locks engaged heavily. The massive diesel engines roared to life. I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my dress, feeling lighter than I had in 3 decades. The flashing blue and red lights painted the brick walls in rhythmic, pulsing colors. The federal transport vans pulled away, their heavy tires gripping the pavement as they dragged Patricia, William, and Victoria out of the gala and out of my life permanently. They were heading to holding cells, brutal interrogations, and eventually federal prison. The crowd of wealthy socialites, corporate sharks, and gossip columnists slowly began to disperse, their excited whispers fading into the cool night air as they rushed to upload their videos and spread the scandal. I turned my back on the alleyway and walked slowly through the heavy service doors, making my way back into the grand ballroom. The extravagant decorations, the towering crystal chandeliers, and the scattered half-empty champagne glasses remained as silent witnesses to the night's explosive events. The room was empty now. The music had stopped entirely. The catering staff had fled, and the tactical teams had secured the perimeter. The absolute chaos had finally ended, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. I stood completely alone in the center of the massive gilded room. I looked up at the blank video screens that had just broadcast the truth to the entire world. The heavy chains of obligation guilt and emotional manipulation that had bound me to the Golden family were finally broken. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the forgotten daughter waiting for scraps of affection. I was completely, undeniably victorious. I took a deep cleansing breath of the quiet air, ready to step out of their shadow and begin my own life. The profound ringing silence of the grand ballroom faded into the sterile humming quiet of the FBI field office. Exactly 12 hours later, I stood shoulder to shoulder with Agent Davis in a cramped, dimly lit observation room. The harsh fluorescent lights from the adjoining interrogation cells bled through the thick two-way glass, casting long, stark shadows across the linoleum floor. We were watching 3 separate live feeds on the high-definition monitors mounted to the wall. The flawless united front my family had aggressively projected for decades had completely disintegrated in record time. It took less than a day in federal custody for the Golden family to start tearing each other apart. On Monitor 1, Patricia paced the length of her concrete cell like a cornered rabid animal. Her pastel couture gown was a wrinkled, stained mess, permanently stripped of its glamorous illusion. She had rubbed her expensive mascara into dark, bruised-looking circles around her panicked eyes. She was shouting at a stoic federal investigator, aggressively pointing her manicured finger at the two-way mirror. She did not know I was standing right behind the glass, but she was performing anyway. She shrieked that she was a victim, a helpless, naive housewife violently manipulated by her overbearing husband. She vehemently claimed William physically forced her to crush those pills. She insisted William made her drug my grandmother. Patricia threw the man she had been married to for 35 years entirely under the bus, without a single second of hesitation, desperate to save whatever scraps of her country club status remained. I shifted my gaze to the second monitor. William looked completely deflated. The imposing corporate titan sat slumped over a cold metal table, sweating profusely through his ruined tuxedo shirt. He was frantically shaking his head, his hands trembling violently as he pointed directly at the camera. He completely abandoned his wife and threw all the blame onto Marcus. He stammered that he knew absolutely nothing about high-level finance, aggressively claiming his son-in-law had orchestrated the offshore accounts and manipulated the legal paperwork. William painted himself as a trusting, gullible father, begging the federal agents to believe Marcus was the sole evil mastermind behind the extortion. The audio from the third room was by far the loudest and most unhinged. Victoria was not answering questions about the elder abuse. She was having a full-blown, hyperventilating meltdown over her rapidly vanishing wealth. An IRS criminal investigator sat calmly across from her, casually sliding asset seizure forms across the metal table. Victoria sobbed uncontrollably, gasping for air as the agent flatly explained that all her bank accounts were officially frozen. Her offshore trust funds were completely locked down. Federal marshals were currently standing inside her sprawling penthouse, actively confiscating her designer handbags, her diamond jewelry, her luxury vehicles, and her passport. She screamed in absolute agony, wailing that she could not survive without her money. The dark reality of federal prison had not even registered in her mind yet. She was entirely consumed by the loss of her material wealth, mourning her seized assets far louder than she mourned the utter destruction of her family. Agent Davis reached forward and muted the monitors, turning to face me. He crossed his arms over his dark, tactical vest and offered a grim, highly satisfied smile. Marcus sang like a bird, Agent Davis stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He gave us the Cayman routing numbers, the encrypted ledgers, and the offshore shell company names. He handed over 20 gigabytes of emails, directly proving your parents initiated the forgery and the drugging. He handed us the entire conspiracy on a silver platter. I looked at the federal agent, feeling a brief, sharp flash of furious injustice. So Marcus just walks away? I asked, my voice tight with anger. He launders millions abuses, My grandmother actively participates in a massive fraud and gets full immunity just because he talked first. Agent Davis shook his head, his smile widening into a shark-like grin. That is exactly what Marcus thinks, the agent replied smoothly. He demanded full immunity, and he assumed his Wall Street arrogance and corporate leverage could buy it. But the Department of Justice does not grant immunity deals to the primary architect of a criminal enterprise. Marcus was not just a low-level broker. The encrypted ledgers he handed over proved he was running a massive, international money laundering syndicate. Your parents were just a tiny, pathetic piece of his overall operation. We used his desperate confession to build the framework, and then we instantly revoked his immunity deal. The FBI is charging him with federal racketeering, Agent Davis confirmed, leaning casually against the electronic console. Marcus just handed us the exact evidence we needed to lock him up in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the next 30 years. He completely played himself. Before I could fully process the massive scale of Marcus's colossal miscalculation, the heavy steel door to the observation room swung open. Charles Sterling, my grandmother's personal estate attorney, stepped into the dim room. He clutched a thick, worn leather briefcase tightly to his chest. His usually stern, unreadable face carried a look of profound, quiet relief. He nodded respectfully to Agent Davis before turning his full attention to me. "Harper, we need to discuss the estate immediately," Charles said, his voice cutting clearly through the low hum of the surveillance monitors. "The federal prosecutors just officially invalidated the forged documents your parents tried to force you to sign. The video evidence of the brutal coercion and the drugging makes their fake will completely null and void." He placed his leather briefcase heavily on the console, snapped the brass locks open, and pulled out a pristine, sealed document bearing the heavy wax stamp of his prestigious law firm. "With the fake will destroyed the actual legal documents your grandmother secured in my private vault. Take immediate effect," Charles explained, handing the heavy parchment directly into my hands. She anticipated their limitless greed. She knew exactly what Patricia and William were capable of, and she made absolutely certain they could never touch a single dime of her fortune. I stared down at the heavy document in my hands, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs. "You are the sole heir, Harper," Charles announced, his words ringing with absolute, undeniable finality. "The estate, the properties, the hidden bearer bonds, everything belongs entirely to you." Exactly 1 month later, the heavy oak doors of Charles Sterling's law firm swung shut behind me. I stood on the bustling Boston sidewalk with a certified federal cashier's check resting securely inside my leather tote bag. $4.5 million. The exact sum my parents and Marcus had ruthlessly stolen from my grandmother was now legally, officially, and permanently restored to my name. Because the funds were recovered through a federal court order following a massive criminal conviction, every single cent was completely tax-free. The United States government had ripped the stolen wealth directly out of Marcus's frozen offshore accounts and placed it right back where it belonged. The feeling of holding that piece of paper was indescribable. It was not just financial security. It was the physical manifestation of ultimate justice. I did not buy a yacht. I did not purchase a penthouse overlooking Central Park or a fleet of imported sports cars. I had watched my family destroy their entire existence, chasing meaningless hollow luxury and superficial status symbols. Instead, I took a small, highly strategic portion of that money and made a single targeted real estate acquisition. When the FBI completely dismantled Marcus's vast money laundering syndicate, the Department of Justice began quietly liquidating his extensive shell company assets to pay off federal restitution. One of those assets happened to be a dilapidated mid-century commercial brick building in the city's arts district. It was the exact same building where I had rented my tiny drafty appraisal studio. The same building where Marcus had ordered his aggressive property manager to illegally evict me just weeks prior. Within 48 hours of the property hitting the commercial market, I outbid every corporate developer in the city and bought the deed outright in cash. I was now my old landlord's boss. The following morning, I walked through the heavy glass double doors of the commercial building. The familiar scent of aged paper oil paint and stale coffee greeted me, but the entire atmosphere felt fundamentally different. I was no longer the desperate, struggling appraiser bracing for a harsh eviction notice. I walked with the steady, unshakable confidence of a woman who owned the ground beneath her feet. I bypassed my old studio and marched straight down the main corridor toward the property management office. Thomas Vance, the smug, bullying property manager, who had gleefully posted the eviction notice on my door and threatened to throw my grandmother's antiques into the street, was pacing frantically behind his cluttered laminate desk. His cheap suit jacket was crumpled, and he was sweating profusely, dabbing his bright red forehead with a crumpled tissue. He had just received the official notification that the building had changed ownership, but the buyer had been listed under a newly formed corporate LLC. He had absolutely no idea who his new employer was until I stepped into his office and quietly closed the frosted glass door behind me. Vance stopped dead in his tracks. The crumpled tissue dropped from his trembling hand and fluttered to the dirty carpet. He stared at me, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated panic as his brain desperately tried to process my presence. "You are trespassing," Vance stammered, his voice lacking all of its previous arrogant authority. "Your lease was officially terminated. You have absolutely no right to be in this building." I walked forward and dropped the thick, notarized stack of ownership deeds directly onto his desk. The loud smack of the heavy paper echoed sharply in the small, stuffy office. "Actually, Thomas, I have every right to be here," I replied, my voice perfectly level and ice cold. "I own the building, I own your office, and I own your employment contract." The remaining color drained completely from his face. He looked down at the official documents, his eyes darting across the page until he saw my signature stamped clearly on the bottom line. His jaw dropped open. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. He opened his mouth to apologize, to backpedal, to spin some pathetic excuse about simply following Marcus's orders and doing his job, but I raised my hand and silenced him immediately. "Pack your things," I ordered, crossing my arms over my chest and staring him down. "You have exactly 1 hour to clear out your desk and vacate my property. You are fired, effective immediately. If you are still inside this building at noon, I will have the police arrest you for criminal trespassing." He did not say a single word. He practically collapsed into his squeaky desk chair, his hands shaking violently as he reached blindly for an empty cardboard box. I left him drowning in his own manufactured misery and walked back out into the main corridor. I looked up at the high, exposed brick ceilings and the massive industrial windows letting in the morning light. Marcus had viewed this space as nothing more than a convenient tax write-off and an illegal vehicle for laundering his dirty money. He had fully intended to gut the historic building, kick out the passionate local artists, and convert it into sterile, overpriced corporate suites. I had a vastly different vision. I was going to transform the entire 70,000 square foot facility into a heavily subsidized cooperative workspace for young struggling artists, independent appraisers, and historical preservationists. I was going to rip up the cheap carpets, restore the original hardwood floors, and build a thriving collaborative sanctuary. It would be a place where creative minds could work and flourish without the crushing constant terror of greedy corporate landlords and sudden, malicious evictions. I planned to offer gallery space at cost, giving unknown creators a chance to display their life's work. It was the exact kind of legacy my grandmother would have been incredibly proud to support. It was a direct, vibrant rejection of everything my parents and my sister stood for. They valued things only by their price tag, but I was building something with actual immeasurable worth. I was standing in the center of the sunlit atrium, mentally mapping out the new floor plans and exhibition spaces, sketching a bright future in my mind, when my cell phone buzzed sharply in my pocket. I pulled the phone out and smiled warmly when I saw the familiar caller ID flashing on the screen. I swiped my thumb across the glass, pressed the green button, and held the phone to my ear. "Diego calls Harper again. Miss Harper, the renovations at Grandma's house are finally finished. You need to come see this." I ended the call, my fingers gripping the sleek edge of my cell phone. A sudden, overwhelming surge of anticipation flooded my chest. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed my keys, hurried out of the commercial building I now officially owned, and slid into the driver's seat of my car. The drive across the city felt entirely different today. For years, traveling this exact route to my grandmother's neighborhood had been an exercise in absolute dread. My stomach used to twist into tight, painful knots at the mere thought of encountering Patricia's suffocating judgment, William's cold indifference, or Victoria's relentless mocking cruelty. I used to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, constantly bracing myself for the inevitable emotional assault waiting behind that heavy front door. Today my hands rested lightly on the leather. The dark, suffocating cloud that had hovered over my entire existence was permanently gone. My family was currently locked away in federal holding cells, their stolen assets seized by the IRS, their fraudulent empire completely reduced to ash. I was driving toward my grandmother's true legacy, and for the very first time in my life, I was entirely free. I turned the final corner onto the familiar tree-lined street and gently pressed the brakes. My car rolled to a slow stop alongside the curb and I shifted into park. I stepped out onto the pavement and simply stared. The transformation was absolutely staggering. The last time I had stood on this sidewalk, the property had been a tragic, decaying shell of its former glory. Patricia and William had deliberately let the estate rot, eagerly waiting for my grandmother to pass away, so they could bulldoze the historic site and sell the lucrative land to commercial developers. The roof had been sagging, the antique wood siding, peeling and gray, the wraparound porch dangerously close to collapsing into the overgrown weeds. Now standing proudly behind the manicured wrought iron fence was a breathtaking masterpiece of architectural preservation. Diego and his team had not just repaired the house, they had painstakingly resurrected its soul. The exterior was painted in rich, historically accurate shades of deep sapphire blue with crisp ivory trim and dark mahogany accents. The sagging roof had been completely replaced with pristine charcoal-colored slate tiles. Gleaming copper flashing caught the bright afternoon sunlight, shining like a beacon. The wraparound porch was completely rebuilt, boasting sturdy, intricately carved pillars and a flawless polished mahogany deck. The yard, once a tangled mess of dead brambles, was now a vibrant, meticulously curated garden, filled with blooming hydrangeas, bright peonies, and climbing roses. It looked exactly the way my grandmother had kept it during my childhood, before her health, and my parents' greed had stripped the beauty away. I pushed open the heavy wrought iron gate and walked slowly up the freshly laid stone pathway. Diego and his core construction crew were standing together on the wide front steps. They were covered in pale drywall dust and smelled faintly of wood stain, but they were grinning from ear to ear. They looked incredibly proud of the magnificent structure standing behind them. Diego stepped forward, wiping his rough, calloused hands on a clean cloth rag. He reached into his heavy canvas tool belt and pulled out a heavy polished brass key. We kept every single piece of original molding we could save. Diego said, his voice thick with genuine respect for the craftsmanship. We stripped 100 years of cheap paint off the banisters, restored the original stained glass in the foyer, and reinforced the entire foundation. She has good bones, Miss Harper, the absolute best I have ever seen. It was an honor to bring this place back to life for you. I reached out and took the heavy brass key from his palm. The cool metal felt incredibly grounding against my skin. I thanked Diego and his crew, my voice thick with unshed tears of profound gratitude. I turned around, slid the key into the ornate lock of the heavy oak front door, and pushed it open. I stepped over the threshold and immediately caught my breath. The interior was magnificent. The stifling smell of neglect, dust, and sickness was entirely gone. Instead, the air was filled with the warm, rich scent of freshly cut cedar lemon oil and clean paint. Golden afternoon sunlight poured through the meticulously restored stained glass window above the landing, casting vibrant pools of ruby red and sapphire blue light across the gleaming, refinished hardwood floors. I walked slowly down the main corridor, letting my fingertips trail lightly along the smooth, polished wood of the wainscoting. I moved through the grand parlor where we used to sit for hours listening to classical records. I walked into the sprawling kitchen where she had taught me how to bake the original farmhouse sink, now gleaming and pristine against the restored butcher block counters. I was completely alone in the massive house, yet it did not feel empty. It felt warm. It felt alive. I could feel my grandmother's vibrant spirit and her unconditional love radiating from every single corner, every polished floorboard, and every sunlit window. The house was breathing again. I placed my hand on the grand mahogany staircase banister and slowly made my way up to the second floor. My footsteps echoed softly in the quiet, peaceful space. I turned right at the top of the landing and walked toward the master bedroom suite. This room had been my grandmother's private sanctuary, the exact place where Patricia and William had committed their ultimate unforgivable betrayal. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The room was immaculate. The walls were painted a soothing, soft cream, and the massive bay windows let in a gentle, comforting breeze. But my eyes were immediately drawn away from the view and locked onto the beautifully restored ornate fireplace mantel on the far wall. Sitting perfectly centered on the pristine, freshly painted white wood was a small, aged envelope. Diego appeared quietly in the doorway behind me, removing his worn work hat. We were pulling up a severely water-damaged section of the heart pine flooring right next to the heavy iron radiator, Diego explained softly, pointing toward the corner of the room. We found a small hidden cavity carved directly into the floor joists. It was wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the dampness. I figured you should be the one to open it. I walked slowly across the master bedroom, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I stopped in front of the fireplace and reached out my fingers, trembling slightly, as I picked up the small, aged envelope. The paper was slightly brittle, yellowed at the edges from time, but perfectly preserved. I looked down at the front of the envelope. The ink was faded, but the elegant sweeping cursive was absolutely unmistakable. It was my grandmother's handwriting, and her final secret message was addressed directly to me. I broke the brittle aged wax seal on the back of the heavy parchment envelope. The thick paper felt incredibly fragile beneath my fingertips, carrying the faint, familiar scent of dried lavender and old books. Diego offered a quiet, respectful nod and silently backed out of the master bedroom, pulling the heavy oak door shut to give me absolute privacy. My hands shook as I unfolded the 2 pages of handwritten script. The ink was slightly faded, but the elegant, sweeping cursive of my grandmother's handwriting was perfectly preserved. "My dearest Harper," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means my worst fears about your parents were entirely justified, but my greatest hopes for you have finally been realized. It means you stood your ground against the storm. It means you stayed true to yourself. You did not sell out. You did not let their relentless greed poison your beautiful heart." I kept reading, my vision blurring as her words painted a vivid picture of the silent war she had waged from her sickbed. "I watched them treat you terribly, Harper," the letter continued. "I saw the way your mother looked at you with pure disdain. I heard the remarkably cruel things your father said when he thought I was not listening. I watched them parade Victoria around like a prized possession while constantly shoving you into the darkest shadows of this family. I knew they considered you a failure, but they were entirely blind to the truth. They worshipped hollow status and sacrificed their own souls for country club memberships. I could not leave my life's work to vultures who would simply tear it apart for quick cash. I needed a protector. I needed someone with actual integrity. I left you the hardest path because I knew you were the only one strong enough to walk it. I knew they would try to break you, and I knew you would never shatter. The house, the money, and the family legacy are yours. You earned every single piece of it. Build a beautiful life, my brave girl. You are finally free." I sank down onto the freshly restored hardwood floor, clutching the thick parchment tightly to my chest. The tears that fell were not tears of grief. They were a massive, overwhelming release of pressure. 3 decades of intense psychological torment evaporated in a single instant. Every single time Patricia had sneered at me and called me an ugly dropout vanished into thin air. Every time William had dismissed me as a pathetic failure washed away completely. The suffocating weight of being the family scapegoat, the constant, desperate hunger for a scrap of parental approval, the endless nights wondering why I was fundamentally unlovable, it was all entirely gone. I was not a disappointment. I was the strongest person in my entire bloodline. My grandmother had seen my true worth when my own parents had treated me like garbage. I sat on the floor of the master bedroom and wept freely, finally experiencing the profound, unconditional love I had been denied my entire existence. The toxic chains of my childhood were permanently severed. After several long minutes, I wiped my face, folded the letter carefully, and placed it inside my jacket pocket. I stood up feeling physically lighter and walked down the grand mahogany staircase. The construction crew had moved their equipment to the back patio, taking their lunch break in the afternoon sun. Diego had left a small portable flat-screen television plugged in on the massive kitchen island, tuned to a local news channel for background noise. I walked toward the kitchen to thank him again, but the urgent tone of the news anchor caught my attention. The headline flashed across the bottom of the screen in bright, bold red lettering. High society scam, Wall Street titan, and socialite in laws officially sentenced. I stopped in the center of the kitchen and turned my full attention to the broadcast. The screen showed courtroom sketches from the federal courthouse downtown. The news anchor reported the final outcome of the massive fraud and extortion case that had consumed the city's elite social circles for the past month. Patricia and William stood before the federal judge in matching beige prison jumpsuits. According to the reporter, Patricia had wept hysterically, begging the judge for leniency and loudly citing her extensive charity work and high standing in the community. The judge remained entirely unmoved. He called their coordinated elder abuse and financial extortion repulsive and handed down a staggering 12 years in federal prison without any possibility of early parole. They were led out of the courtroom in heavy steel handcuffs, completely stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their freedom. The broadcast quickly shifted to Marcus. The arrogant Wall Street titan had walked into the courtroom expecting a light sentence after turning state's evidence against my parents. He smiled smugly at his defense attorneys, completely confident in his corporate invincibility. But the federal prosecutors had used his own encrypted ledgers to hit him with massive racketeering charges. The judge showed zero mercy, sentencing Marcus to 8 hard years in a medium-security federal penitentiary. His elite financial career was permanently destroyed, his assets completely seized, and his arrogant smirk entirely wiped away. Then the news segment pivoted to the fallout. The reporter discussed the complete financial ruin of the family's youngest daughter. The IRS had officially audited Victoria's lifestyle, uncovering years of tax evasion tied to Marcus's offshore accounts. The federal government seized her luxury penthouse, her sports cars, her diamond jewelry, and every single cent to her name. The screen cut to a brief, grainy video clip shot by a local gossip reporter on a cell phone. I stared at the television, completely mesmerized by the absolute justice of the universe. Victoria, the flawless, arrogant, golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my existence, was wearing a cheap, stained polyester uniform. Her perfectly styled hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her expensive manicured nails were ruined. She was holding a dirty rag, aggressively scrubbing sticky tables at a grimy, fluorescent-lit diner on the edge of town. She was working the graveyard shift for minimum wage, desperately trying to survive, while drowning in the massive mountain of legal debts her criminal family had left behind. I reached forward and turned off the television. The screen faded to black, leaving the beautiful sunlit kitchen in perfect peace. I turned my back on my family's destruction and walked out into the bright, warm afternoon to claim the brilliant future I had fought so hard to build. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air carried the rich scent of wood smoke, roasted garlic, and sweet apple cider through the expansive backyard of my grandmother's estate. I stood at the edge of the sprawling mahogany porch, adjusting the delicate clasp of my emerald green evening gown. The sheer magnitude of the transformation still occasionally took my breath away. The overgrown, decaying graveyard of dead weeds and rotting lumber had been entirely reborn. A massive white event tent was pitched perfectly on the manicured lawn, illuminated by hundreds of warm golden string lights draped elegantly through the branches of the ancient oak trees. This was not just a celebration of a house restoration. It was the official grand opening gala for the Beatrice historical appraisal firm. I had deliberately converted the entire first floor of the Victorian mansion into my new corporate headquarters. The grand parlor, once suffocated by my parents' greed and neglect, now served as a breathtaking reception area. The walls were lined with custom-built cherry wood shelving, displaying rare historical artifacts and immaculate appraisal portfolios. The massive dining room had been transformed into a state-of-the-art authentication laboratory outfitted with the best lighting and technology money could buy. I had named the firm after the woman who had made it all possible, ensuring her legacy would be spoken with absolute respect in the historical preservation community for decades to come. I walked down the porch steps and seamlessly joined the vibrant crowd gathering on the lawn. The energy was electric, completely devoid of the suffocating toxic pretense that had always poisoned my parents' high society events. There were no fake socialites here. There were no arrogant hedge fund managers judging the cost of the catering or whispering vicious gossip behind crystal champagne flutes. Instead, the yard was filled with a diverse, brilliant mosaic of genuine people who had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. Diego and his entire construction crew had traded their dusty tool belts and work boots for sharp, tailored suits. They were currently gathered around a massive outdoor fire pit, laughing loudly and exchanging stories with the passionate young painters, sculptors, and historical preservationists who now occupied my subsidized cooperative workspace downtown. The artists had brought easels and canvases, setting up impromptu live painting exhibitions along the garden paths, filling the evening with vibrant bursts of uninhibited creativity. I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder and turned to see Special Agent Davis standing behind me. He was wearing a sharp navy suit holding a small plate of appetizers. He offered a respectful, warm smile, his sharp eyes taking in the thriving celebration around us. "The firm looks incredible, Harper," he said, his voice entirely sincere. "You built something truly remarkable here." The Department of Justice officially closed the books on the Sterling and Jenkins syndicate yesterday. The asset liquidation is fully complete. They have nothing left to hide behind. I smiled back, clinking my glass gently against his. "Thank you, Agent Davis, for believing me, for listening when no one else would." He nodded slowly, looking up at the beautifully restored exterior of the house. "You did the hard work. You survived the storm. Enjoy the peace you earned." As Davis walked away to join a conversation with Diego, I took a slow, deep breath, letting the incredible reality of my new life wash over me. My mind briefly flashed to the grim, desolate existence my family was currently enduring. Patricia and William were locked in small, sterile concrete cells, stripped of their designer clothes and their fragile manufactured superiority. They were spending their days following strict, humiliating routines, entirely forgotten by the wealthy friends they had desperately tried to impress. Marcus was rotting in a medium-security facility, his arrogant power entirely shattered. Victoria was clocking in for her grueling graveyard shift at the grease-stained diner, scrubbing floors and waiting on rude customers, permanently drowning in the massive financial consequences of her own malicious entitlement. They had desperately tried to bury me. They had mocked me, stolen from me, and treated my very existence like a disgraceful burden. But their relentless cruelty had not broken me. It had forged me into a weapon of absolute truth. I had not just survived their betrayal. I had meticulously dismantled their entire fraudulent empire and built my own impenetrable sanctuary directly on top of the ruins. A gentle chime rang out across the garden. Diego was tapping a silver spoon against his champagne flute, standing on the edge of the mahogany porch. The vibrant chatter immediately quieted down as the crowd turned their attention toward him. He smiled broadly, raising his glass high into the crisp autumn air. To Harper, Diego called out, his voice echoing warmly across the illuminated lawn. To the woman who saw the true value in old bones, forgotten artists, and discarded things. To the Beatrice historical appraisal firm, and to a beautiful future built on solid ground. The crowd erupted into genuine enthusiastic applause. I felt a hot tear of pure joy slip down my cheek. I raised my own crystal flute of champagne toward the warm, glowing string lights above. I looked past the cheering crowd, my eyes traveling up the magnificent facade of the historic Victorian mansion. The sapphire blue paint looked almost magical against the dark evening sky. I could feel my grandmother standing right there beside me, her protective spirit woven into the very foundation of the home. I took a slow, satisfying sip of the cold champagne. The taste was sharp, sweet, and perfectly crisp. The scapegoat daughter had not simply escaped her tormentors, she had conquered them. I was standing in the center of an empire fueled by fierce integrity, undeniable wealth, and profound unconditional love. I realized then with absolute unwavering certainty that the ultimate sweetest revenge in the world was simply living a beautiful life. The most powerful lesson from Harper's journey is that true vindication doesn't come from retaliation, but from radically choosing your own peace. When surrounded by a toxic family that values superficial status over genuine connection, it is easy to become bitter. However, Harper proves that the ultimate sweet revenge is simply living beautifully. By breaking the cycle of greed and restoring her grandmother's legacy with fierce integrity, she built an empire of authentic self-worth. Her triumph reminds us that our value is never defined by those who fail to see it. Share your own story of reclaiming your worth and comment below.